The display value inline block generates an element that's like a block element, but it's also flowed with its surroundings as if it were an inline element. So you get a combination of both inline and block level display. Now, the advantage to using inline block over the inline method we used in the previous video is that you can style an inline block element as you would a block level element with width, height, and top and bottom margins while keeping it on the same line as the elements beside it. Back in my style sheets media query, I'm going to change the display value of the name, main nav, and main nav list items from inline to inline block. When I refresh the web page, notice how the name element's width expands. So it's now accepting the 240 pixel width we defined earlier. And when I resize the browser viewport, notice how the main nav wraps to the next line as one block. Now, I could adjust the layout with the media query so that the nav doesn't drop below the site name like this, but for now, I'll stick with the default behavior and flow of these inline block elements. Once the container and the header starts to get a little narrow, the nav simply drops to the next line. Now, I'm okay with this because, again, it's just the normal browser behavior of inline block elements. Plus, I don't want the header to look too cramped on narrow screens, so this opens up the space a bit. In the previous video, when the name element's display was set to inline, I couldn't apply top and bottom margins. But now that the display is set to inline block, it will accept any top and bottom margin values. So in the name rule, if I add a margin top property and set the value to 50 pixels, we can see that it now applies that 50 pixel top margin to the name element. Now, I don't want this large gap in my header, so I'll go ahead and remove the margin top declaration from the name rule. So the clickable areas in the header links are still quite small. Notice how in small screens, even when the links expand to the full width of the page, the cursor changes only when I place my mouse over the text area. I want to make the hover target taller and wider so that these links are easier to click with a mouse and easier to tap on touchscreen devices. If I set the link's display value to block, it will make them as wide as their parent elements. It will also apply the top and bottom padding values I defined earlier here in the navigation rules. So in the CSS rule that targets the links inside name and main nav, I'll add a display property and set the value to block. So now these links are going to be block level elements. When I refresh my page, notice how the links take on the top and bottom padding values. So their height expands by 20 pixels because I set the top and bottom padding value to 10 pixels. So now the full width and height of the links are clickable areas. One of the advantages of inline block display is that you can easily center a horizontal nav in the header. This is something that's a little bit trickier to do with other layout methods like floats. So I'm going to display the name and main nav on separate lines in large screens, so all the way up to the max width. Back in my style sheet, if I scroll down to the media query, and if I remove the main nav class selector from this rule, when I save my style sheet and refresh the page, we can see how main nav is back to being a block level element, so it drops down to the next line. So now to center align these elements in the header, I'll go back to my style sheet and scroll up to the main header rule, and I'll add a text align property and set the value to center. This will center align the content inside main header. And I'll also scroll down to the media query and remove the right margin from the name rule. I no longer need this right margin because now both the name and main nav are in separate lines. And there you have it, a perfectly centered horizontal navigation. Now, if you want to keep the name and navigation on the same line and left align like it was earlier, that's fine. It's all up to you.